some of the other funding offers for electric vehicles had a lot more detail around how the money was going to be distributed over different periods of time. And this one simply said 130 million over 5 years. And so just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit, Sylvain, around kind of what is the current funding in this particular phase, and what your expectations are. You know, you've got all this merit-based evaluation criteria, which would imply that you think that you're going to receive far more applications in than you actually have money to expend. So maybe can you just talk to some of these questions here?
Sure. Okay. So the 130 million is over 5 years, and most likely, you know, that money is divided within the 5 years with a different profile. This year, we have earmarked $9 million out of the 130 million because we know that we can probably spend for a full year. And also knowing that with an election coming, we're quite limited into the work that we can do for that period until the new government is in place. So we have about 9 million. With that being said, the 9 million does not dictate the amount that the RFP will receive, or it's the amount that we allocate to the RFP. If we look at the previous program, we never really gave the amount because depending on what comes in and the strength of the project, we want to be flexible. And that's where we never kind of disclose the amount particularly, but we kind of want to have like a minimum threshold of 60. So if we have a good number of projects that meets that 60% threshold, and we can fund them, and we have enough to distribute between maybe this year and next year, we'll try to fund them all. If not, then we may have to kind of cut back, but we don't want to go with an allocation like right from the get-go. So we want to see the project coming first and see you know where it goes. So that's why I can really give you that number. But for this year, we're hoping to spend about $9 million because it's always the situation that if you don't use it, you lose it. So there's no you know, we don't expect to reprofile, which means that you take money from a year to move it to the next year. We want to make sure that we spend that $9 million. So there might be other RFP that might take some of that money, but this is where we are right now for the first year. So I can just go down to the question. We're probably expecting to have more applications than the funding that we have. If we look at past, you know, with the previous program, I mean, this program is always, you know, majorly oversubscribed. So we're expecting the same. When we did an expression of interest just before launching the RFP, we've got a lot of project, large project, small project, but we've got project that would probably use the fund 3 or 4 times. So we're thinking that it might be a very competitive, a very fierce competition amongst projects. So yes, there will be definitely, we expect that there'll be more qualified applications that we have funding available. In terms of established targets and preference, we don't discriminate from, you know, based on geography, residential versus suburban or urban core, or even within the public and on-street. We're quite open. This is a program that will look at deploying infrastructure massively. We're not, you know, it's not just targeted. It's really to have the infrastructure in place as much as we can. So we're always going to go with the project presented where the project makes sense, the business case makes sense, the readiness is there. So project that ranks high will get the funding, unless there's an issue where we're starting to see that, you know, all the projects are, let's say, for example, are happening in Vancouver, then we might kind of look at it and see what we can do. But we are not going to try to target or put preferences into the application. The criteria are quite clear, and we're only going to use those merit to really look at project and really rank them and then fund them. So for now, there's no targeted geographic or others. In terms of resubmission, people that try to participate with the electric vehicle and alternate fuels infrastructure deployment phase 2 and was unsuccessful. Most of them, if you have had an application, you can have a debrief. We can explain you how your application can be moved to the new program. We want to minimize the work that you have to put into your application. So we're willing to take the application as is if it meets the 20 infrastructure minimum. So that's the only element. Now, if you have 10 station that was put forward and did not receive the funding, you may want to recast, add the other 10 station infrastructure and resend it. What we found so far is that people, when they know that they can actually just recast and resubmit, they usually take it back because they want to add the level 2s. Because remember, the first program, we only do fast chargers and we cannot fund the level 2s. For this one, we can do all the technologies. And most deployment that happens, it's a fast chargers with a level 2 on one side. So now people have the chance to go back and recast their proposal with the level 2, and we would fund both. So that's the advantage of recasting the proposal. But we are okay to accept that application as is, just to eliminate the burden on the applicant. In terms of future funding for public places and on-street, we are expecting, as we said in the guide, that we will launch at least once a year an RFP for each stream that we want to target. Now, if an RFP can have a combo of stream, for this one, we've put public places and on-street because it made sense. The next one, it could be, for example, workplace and MURBs, or we can attack it with 2 different RFP. The reason why we want to do this is that we feel that we're targeting different projects when we go, into a public or on-street or MURBs or workplace. So when we look at the RFP, we want to compare, apples to apples. We want to compare projects that are quite similar in terms of deployment, and that's to make it fair. But also it's to manage the workload for the department, to make sure that we look at a type of project, we launch the RFP, we negotiate, and then we move on to the next RFP. But per year, we're striving to launch an RFP for each stream at least once a year. So for public places and on-street, the next RFP next year will happen, and will happen for the other 4 years of the program. So for other available level 2 or DCFC EV funding, not from our organization. So we have the 2 programs. We have the Electric Vehicle and Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Deployment Initiative, the one that has been running since 2016. I'm sure you're all familiar, and this one. Now, there's always some project remaining in terms of demonstration. So there's a demonstration program, but that's just for demonstration aspect, not for deployment. So I just crossed all those questions. So hopefully it was clear and I gave the information needed.
That was stunning. That was really amazing. Does anybody have any questions for Sylvain beyond the ones that we had here? And recognizing we have many more to come. So is there anything else that came up from what Sylvain just said?
Sylvain, it's Megan. Just a quick question. Are you okay with the project manager for an application that was declined through electric vehicle and alternative fuel to contact you just to discuss their situation? It's over 20 stations, so I think it's eligible.
Absolutely. If you have like the project, I can go back and look at it. But yes, we can have a one-on-one call to kind of look at the project, maybe even having a debrief on what happened to the project. But most likely, most of the project that did not get funding, it's just because it was starting to become more of a ZEVIP kind of objective and not really a coast-to-coast corridor on highways. So that's why I think we're going to look at it. So if you want, you can give me a call back and we can look at it and see what you would like to do, if you want to leave it as is or you want to recast and then resend it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. So I guess I just wanted to give a little bit of background into the reason for why we asked for this call today, and it's mostly because in Vancouver and amongst the BC Hydro Community Energy Manager Network, there was a lot of chatter that was coming my way, and concern that there was a lot of struggle from some local governments around how they were going to apply for this particular funding offer, and so that kind of raised flags for me because. And for BC Hydro, because we see that in most instances, particularly as it relates to EVs, that it is in the Lower Mainland of BC where we have some of the strongest capacity and demand and support from Hydro and the province and Metro Van. So this made me a little bit concerned that this might be a much larger issue for the rest of Canada than perhaps because the BC cities are so advanced with their EV work that maybe they were just talking about it because they were the ones digging deep into these applications early on, and that others who thought they were going to be able to participate would realize later that there was going to be some challenges for them. So I did kind of canvass our CUSP cities and found that we did have some really common barriers being cited that were similar to those in BC with other cities. And so that's why I asked for this call, and thanks very much for being so quick to accepting pulling this call together. So I just wanted to hit on sort of the top, and really there's they were really common across everybody. There was these three barriers, and then kind of exacerbated by this tight funding timeline. It was the more ubiquitous issue for everybody, that they felt like they could maybe overcome some of these barriers if the timing wasn't so constrained. But the combination of these three and the timeline were really going to be challenging for them. And so the goal here today is, to see whether or not we can find some workarounds or some solutions that will help to diminish a couple of these barriers for cities so that more of them can participate. There's definitely some of our cities, I can share some poll results with you. We definitely have a lot of our cities who are planning to apply. And Ian and others can talk to why they're in a position to be able to do that may be unique and exceptional to the majority of cities in Canada at the moment. So we'll get to those, but these are kind of the three main barriers. Is obviously the minimum purchase requirements of 20 stations, the feeling that the co-funding amounts are inadequate, particularly for public places and on street. And then the restrictions around third party, and some of it is also just not having great clarity on what those restrictions are exactly. So I wanted to get a little bit of clarity on that.
Okay.
We're going to go into each one of these. Oh yeah.
Great.
No, so
okay,
thanks. So wow, we got it all together. So I think on this one, Nadine, were you going to talk to this one? Yeah.
Yeah, just broadly speaking, and from I'm coming into this from the perspective of the City of Toronto as well, a little bit. So some of the challenges with regards to the timelines are the planning, like the staff resources required to plan and implement such a project. So for us at the City of Toronto, this is very much a cross-divisional initiative that includes transportation and many other divisions as well, including the utilities, so Toronto Hydro as well. So we know that securing funding, finding appropriate sites for the installation of a minimum of 20 chargers is a big feat for us, and it's a bit of a challenge. We're still working on finalizing a legal agreement to pilot a few on-street chargers in the City of Toronto, and this has been taking months to accomplish. So this is one obstacle. The other is obtaining approvals for the sites. So for us, for example, at the City of Toronto, because we're working on an electric mobility strategy and this has not been finalized yet, we do have to go to council to get approval on certain site locations. And we also need to find partners willing to install the EV chargers with us. So far, it's been Toronto Hydro, but we need to confirm that for the other projects. And then there are additional complexities with compounding the resources and time required to plan and execute this well is also a technological challenge, including land use challenges as well, and so on. So there's also the implementation of these chargers and the commitment or the long timelines that we need to account for procurement. So for us, this is also another challenging aspect. So this is just to name a few. I don't know if there are others that I missed here. Yeah, I'm not sure, Alison, if you want to chime in or add a few to these as well. Yeah.
I mean, maybe Edmonton, I gave an example there that was actually, a success story where Edmonton is actually finding themselves in a good position to apply. Do you want to talk a little bit to that, Jeannie?
Yeah, so we have been working with a funding partner actually ever since late last year to do a pilot level 2 charging project across city property, so recreation centers, parks, et cetera, et cetera. When this funding came around, we were luckily in a position to do it, but it took us from late last year to even now to nail down up to like 19 sites to even and get approvals for those. And we're still, our agreement with our funding partner is not even executed at this point. So I can't see, and we're just lucky because our agreement is almost executed, but I can't see others if they've just started in June to get to that level where they can get a submission in. It's a lengthy timeline.
Does anyone else want to talk to that?
Sure, I'll chime in here. So this is Lindsay from Winnipeg. I know with our timeline of September 18th as the submission deadline, I think our next council meeting is scheduled for September 20th or 26th, so it would be at least a week after the deadline before we would be able to, assuming that we can get a number of these sites approved and identified. Even if we get all that together, we wouldn't be able to have council approval to enter into the agreement or to get the in-year funding to get our 50% of the funds together, at least until about a week after the deadline. So certainly the timelines are very restrictive for us to be able to apply.
Great, thanks. And I know that, you know, I live in Victoria. I know that the council schedules are very similar here as well. They're pretty light in the summertime. So on this particular slide, I've got the timelines up just to remind everybody of what they are, and then a few questions just to see if there's a way to try and massage this a little bit to enable some additional applications. So obviously the first is an extension of the funding offer possible, and I understand Toronto's already asked that and received a no to that particular question, so we just thought we'd throw that one out. And then the other is there a way to move this towards being an open-ended funding offer? It sounds like from your earlier comments that you anticipate this being oversubscribed, so it really that would really help. And so then I guess the last one is more around some of these sticking points for approvals. Is it possible to take those out of the mandatory requirements at pre-approval and push them to the, you know, when the letter of conditional approval comes in November, or, you know, to having it done prior to execution of the cost sharing contribution agreement, which would be, you know, more like December, January. Would give people the fall. Is something like that possible, perhaps?
So, so I can talk a bit about it, and it's kind of and it's interesting, and I get you know, the timeline and how things must move quickly. There's two reasons why, and I'll just explain a bit of our reasonings. That so for this particular year, we, like I said earlier, we have $9 million that we need to expend. So we have to have projects that are going like as quickly as we can. So that's why. You know, we provided the 90 days, roughly 90 days open RFP. So we are able to, after the RFP, look at all the proposal, make the decision, notify the applicant, and then sign the CAs. Because of course the project can't start, but anything that is spent cannot be claimed for repayment. So we're trying to really accelerate. This year is quite an interesting year because we only got, you know, in budget the green light that we were going. So we know the window is a bit small to apply. It is something that we can, you know, we can extend if it's needed in future RFP. We can look at 120 days. But this year we want to make sure that we have enough time that once the project is approved, they can actually spend and claim the amount of dollars. What we don't want is to see that $9 million go to waste and be returned when it could have gone to some projects. So I understand the frustration, but this is what we're trying to deal with. So we're trying to balance that. Open-ended program, it is very difficult for us because it really removes any planning with the funding that we have. So let's say we have, let's say $10 million in a year. If we do an open-ended, we have no certainty of how much we will spend until maybe late in the year, and maybe if we don't have the amount of project that we thought we were going to have, then again, it's that money that we're losing. So this is why we like to have RFP, because first of all, it'll be oversubscribed, so we want to make sure that we fund the right project, the ones that are advanced and the ones that are ready, but also it's to know exactly how much money will go back to the economy to make sure that we don't lose that money or we're not surprised at the end of the year. So that's why we always work with RFP and for that particular two reasons. In terms of all-site, and I'll explain it because one thing that we'll talk about is the third party. And there was on the guide, this is that third party is not allowed. And we'll explain a bit of what we're thinking about third party and how that will solve a lot of your problem, actually, when we are opening the third party. And I'll explain why we didn't open it for this particular one. But that mechanism will probably resolve, I would say, most of your issues that is being presented right now. But we'll go through the question, and then at the end I'll talk about the third party and how we envision it, and see if that becomes a very helpful tool for all of you.
Great. I'm going to move on to the next barriers. Anybody have anything else to talk about related to the timeline? Okay. So I think Ian is going to share some thoughts here on why Vancouver, from the poll that we've done, Vancouver is looking to be, not surprisingly, leading in terms of the number of units they're going to be purchasing. So he was going to talk a little bit to why that they might be a little bit more unique than others.
Sure, thanks, Allison. And I think our situation actually sounds pretty similar to where Edmonton is. We have a strategy that's been in place since 2016, and that included commitments to get level 2 installed at basically almost every community center in the city, as well as having DC fast charging hubs sort of located around the city. And so within that, we do have already council approval to proceed with the strategy in general. We are going to be actually reapplying for some DC fast chargers that were rejected under the last call. So we actually have budget approvals for those. And we do have budget approval for, a number of the level 2s, because we're probably looking at about 30 to 35 that we would be looking to add. But we'd still probably have to go to council at some point after we apply to sort of get the funding allocation. And we're in a position where we can actually do that, where we have up to a month to approach council after we've applied for that money, as long as we just can't sign contribution agreements. So I think we have some unique circumstances in that we already had a lot of that in place, and most of our funding, at least approvals, were there, and we also have this council mandate to move ahead. And to the point made by Edmonton, it takes a long time to put all that stuff in place. A lot of our plans around installations are on our own properties, and that's largely because we had sort of strategized that we might need a go it alone type of approach. So we've kind of planned around doing as much as we can at city properties. The DC fast chargers that we'll be reapplying for will be on street. We wouldn't be applying for any on-street level 2s that were standalone, simply because the funding amounts are nowhere near what it costs to put level 2 on street. We know this because we've done several across the city already. But I think that, the big thing is that we are a larger city. We do have a fairly well-established plan. We have a lot of background in installing stations already. We've got, I think there are 9 or 10 DC fast chargers in Vancouver, and hundreds of level 2s. So we have a pretty good idea what we're sort of doing and have that all lined up. But if you were trying to start on that process in the summertime, like many city councils, like our city council doesn't sit in August. There's no way to get in front of them before September 18th. And as a result, there's obviously a backlog in our July meetings and September meetings when everyone else is trying to get priorities through. So I think having 90 days in the summer is limiting, and then like I said, to try and pull together a plan on that sort of timeline is unrealistic. And if you were trying to do it with third parties, I don't know how that would even be possible. I don't know how you'd even get interest in that time. So I think that's kind of roughly where I sort of wanted to talk about. But if folks have questions about what we're doing or how we fit into it, I'm happy to answer them.
This is probably a good time for you, Megan, to talk a little bit about these pooling applications that the work that CEA has done in Southern Alberta and in the Kootenays.
Yeah, sure. I think, I guess one of the issues when the EOI came out in April, we We did submit for 60 level 2s and 5 fast chargers. I submitted on behalf of the Regional District of East Kootenays because that is literally the only way they will do something if there's an aggregated third-party coordinated approach. Because of the significant capacity constraints at small to medium-sized communities, and particularly in these rural areas where EV infrastructure is not, the primary asset or infrastructure concern. So yeah, it was certainly well, and I guess Sylvain, it would be great if you could further articulate the limitations on the third-party piece for this current intake and how that will be different in future. Although it's probably too late for us to coordinate anything at this point if it were an option. But yeah, I think the model that we've been able to demonstrate in both southern BC, southern interior, and in Alberta, is that approach of alleviating these smaller communities from the burden of taking on the entire financial liability on their own, and B, all of the coordination of RFPs, procurement, coordinating installs, site selection over a broad geographical scale. And I think what we're trying to achieve in these areas is that connectivity across rural areas that connect to the urban centers where majority of the electric vehicles, of course, being purchased. But a key barrier in those areas being limitations to travel when they want to travel, and the freedom of connectivity throughout those rural areas. So yeah, maybe Sylvain, I'll if now's the time to pass it over to you to kind of explain for this current intake. My understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that third party is defined as, I guess what you're trying to do is minimize money being received by a third party and then distributed as sort of a sub-grant. I guess what we were proposing was actually doing all of the legwork, confirming the procurement, and acting on behalf of the local governments. And I did pose this question through the email and received a quick response of, it's not eligible. But if you could further articulate the constraints.
For sure. So I think it's a good time to talk about the third party and the limitations. So third party will allow an organization to act, and let's say on behalf of NRCan, but we will be able to manage a portion of the funding without being the ultimate recipient. So that is a different agreement that we have in place. So an organization can work with us, but then ultimately are not the ultimate recipient. So they are not the end party who receive the funding, who put the infrastructure and get in place. Right now, because of the contribution agreement, we can only sign with one entity, and that entity is responsible to own the equipment for the duration of the project and responsible to report on it and secure the financing. We know that this is not for all. It's that mechanism can work very well for a direct recipient and ultimate recipient, but when we're looking at municipalities, that brings an issue. So for the third party, we've put the restriction of third party because people have heard that we were looking at that particular aspect to design the program, but we didn't want to launch there for two main reasons. We have other streams that we're going to do funding. So the workplace, the MURBs, the fleet, the workplace, all of those streams, will be, are being designed and completed. What we want to do with third party is that an organization can come to NRCan and with much more flexibility than what we're having right now in this RFP. So for example, the site won't need to be fully identified because they're not the ultimate recipient. So they will come to NRCan, and this is how we envision it. That might change, but with the conversations that I've had with municipalities and from what I'm seeing here, I think it will work well. So a municipality could come to, or an organization, or for example, Fraser Basin Council. And we had a call actually, and we talked about it with Fraser Basin Council. They come in and said, this is what we want to do. We have an objective of doing, let's say, 1,000 level 2 across a certain area. But what we want is not just to do public and on-street, but we also want to do fleet. We want to do workplace. So the third party will allow that mechanism, so someone can come on behalf of an organization, but also will be able to cross all the stream with the funding that they receive. The reason why that we haven't opened it is because we need to make sure that the workplace and the MERBS aspects have been designed and nailed. And the reason why we're still it's still not completed is because there's provincial programs that have already programs of that nature. So BC has a MERB and a workplace, and Quebec as well. So first, we need to make sure that what we're going to launch for MERBs and workplace align with those jurisdictions. So what we put as a program does not negatively impact their program. We want to make sure that the funding can be stacked, so federal and provincial funding can be stacked and provided, minimize the for the recipient, the applicant, the burden of maybe applying for two funds. So there's all of that that we have to look at. But ultimately, once this is resolved, then we can actually open the third-party aspect. And third-party for a project will be able to not just do a certain stream, but all stream. And that's the intent of what we want to do with third-party. So that should, and third-party will allow much more time because, again, we're not expecting a third-party to come and say, I have it all figured out and we're going to do 500 and then here's all my partners. We want to partner with with organization that has a plan that says this is what we're going to do. We're hoping to do, let's say, 10% of workplace, 20% in on street, and 70% on fleet. And then we can work with that, provide the funding, and then the project continues. But then we don't have to go so restrictive on that RFP. So this is our intent. This is why we didn't launch third party immediately. Some people have knew that we were going to launch it because we've done consultation in Quebec City before we launched the program. So there was a lot of interest, but we didn't want to go there right now because we want to make sure that we open it up to all the streams. But when I look at the purchase and the pooling of municipality to come to the program, I'm hoping that that will resolve. For example, in BC, so Fraser Basin Council, for people that are not from BC, they could come to NRCan and say, the BC, we have a plan to install or fund 1,000 level 2 stations. So we would love to have 1,000 level 2 stations funded by the government of Canada, and we will continue to administer our program, and we're just going to stack it. So then for an applicant to Fraser, they get automatic funding from the government, from the federal government. So that's what we're trying to work. I think it's just because of the timing and because we needed to put something out immediately. But this probably will solve, I would say, most of the problem that has been presented. We expect to launch it, so the third party this year, a bit later in the year. So that's, but again, I can't really commit on a date just to make sure so we don't, so we're ready. But we expect to have it launched before the end of the calendar year, actually, third party.
So to clarify, the contribution agreement would be signed with the third party organization who would then work with the municipalities.
Yeah, or it could be a municipality that acts now on behalf of many municipalities, but ultimately they don't have to own the project. They don't have to secure the financing for all of the other parties. They just act as an agent almost of the government. And what they do, they're just responsible to report on what they've done with the funding, and they actually claim they do claim for payment on behalf of all the ultimate recipients. So that's what a third party is. It's a bit of it's kind of an administrator role actually for that third party, but it allows that kind of grouping of municipalities or organization to deliver on the program. We understand that it's going to take much more time to. So hold on, I'm just going to change my my earpiece. Just is dying on me. Just hold on. Okay. So yeah, so it will allow that, like I said, that. Organization from multiple parties to actually come to the program.
And is that within the $9 million budget, like this third party call by the end of the year? Is that within that or in addition to?
It will be, well, it depends on when it's launched and how long we leave on the RFP. I'm not expecting from what we're going to get out of it will be signed and spent on that $9 million, because if we launch it like later in the year by end of calendar year, it doesn't give us much more time to look at all the proposal, make sure that we choose the right organization to do it, and then sign the CA, and then they have to do some more to get the project started. So we don't expect that the project would start this year. But we'll try to launch it as quickly as we can, give enough time for the application to make sure that we do it well, and then hopefully we can have the third-party delivery agent in place early in the next fiscal year to deliver on some project.
Okay, my last sort of point from the sort of rural perspective would just be to caution around expecting that there's going to be match funding coming from workplace or MURB in that context. So we don't have a lot of MURBs in these small communities across rural Canada generally. And similarly with workplace, I mean, maybe a school district might have fleet, the extent of fleet that would be considered reasonable to do a fleet assessment on. But again, a lot of the local governments are small. They've got 1 to 20 vehicles. It's quite an effort to go through fleet assessment and determine opportunities for replacement, and that is typically not even a new vehicle, right? So I would just appreciate that sort of lens being applied on when we're looking at integrating other funding streams to consider sort of the rural context of those communities.
And again, this is all what we're thinking. That's the approach that we're looking at. Nothing of what I've said is may materialize or not. But for a third party, let's say that, and just for example, the minimum 20 is there. So an organization or a municipality could say, well, I'm going to do 16 on street, and I have my own fleet that I'd love to electrify. So I'll put 4 chargers actually that would be considered either workplace or fleet. So you'll be able to mix those infrastructure actually within a project, which probably would help also, because the diversification, it's quite hard to just target like a stream per especially with a minimum. So with that third party, it can allow people to mix the application. So we hope that we're going to see some project, but again, we'll have to test it and see how it works. So that's why we want to make sure that we design it well and we launch it when it's appropriate, and we've looked at all of those I would say barriers, but challenges.
That's great. Yeah, the minimum actually didn't intimidate our communities. It was the inability to aggregate and do the third party. So thanks.
Yeah, and that's what we're hoping. There's organizations out there that can work on behalf of those communities. So if you have 5 communities that pulls together, then through a third party, then that's hopefully that's what will help them.
Great. So I think the other comment or the other question we had that was related to third parties was actually one that you raised, Jeannie. It's the number 2 here on the slide. Maybe just describe how you're rolling out in Edmonton so that people understand why you have this scenario happening for you.
Yeah, so it is. I'm not sure if this is present in other cities, but for us, the intent for our pilot project is to place the charging facilities on city properties. The city doesn't sign perpetual leases, indefinite leases on the charging equipment, on installations, on usage of city land. So in our pilot project, when we first approached it, we were going to do either 5 to 10 years. So I just want a clarification for Sylvain to see if the deployment has a term limit for how long the charges have to be in operations for, because I get that it's permanent installations, and under the previous deployment, it was a 10-year minimum. For us to sign anything past 10 years, we'll have to go to council, which is not going to meet the timeline.
Right. So this is a requirement that we remove in this new program. So there's no time for the access to site. So we're hoping that the participant have access, and they will need to demonstrate through a letter. But there's not a requirement for a legally binding agreement with a period. If, for example, the project is repayable and you have access for 5 years, we could at one point in the 5 years says, can you demonstrate that you still have access for the next 5 years? But right now, we decided not to go there because that was one of the things that created a bit of a headache for our participant. So, and because of level 2 don't have the life expectancy of a fast charger, then it was going to get very difficult. So we consulted with our legal advisor, and was basically we determined that maybe we can just make sure that they have access to site, but the period is within the agreement, because there is a clause in the agreement that says that you have to have through the conduct of the project, and if you're repayable, that you have all the rights and access to the project. So by default, we're going to let the agreement speak for itself. So for the application, it's not a requirement anymore.
So how do you demonstrate that they're permanent installations? There's no term limit.
Give me an example.
So I mean, like, if there's no term limit to how long the stations have to be operational for, and that they just have access to land, how do you define permanent installations? Because I thought that was one of the eligibility criteria.
Correct. So in the agreement, depending on the repayability or not, there is a period for the project is determined for the asset that has been paid. So there is a requirement of a certain number of years that will be part of the negotiation. So I can't advance a number, but it is part of the agreement where we say that the infrastructure that is in place, have been paid for the government of Canada, must be in place for X number of years. If there's a change to that, then they just need to let us know, and there's all kind of costs. But right now, I'm not going to advance any number of years, but that's how we ensure that what we funded remain on site. And we have, through the agreement, a clause that if we want to go and visit to make sure that it's still on the site, we can do that and we can exercise that. But it will be part of the negotiation of the contribution agreement. So, yeah, I'm just going to not advance on the number of years right now.
Okay.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, just under actually, and we've still got a few more questions to go. So let's move into this last one here, which is kind of the meaty one around just, we want to share some of the actual costs that the cities are seeing, and you can see here on the slide what they're seeing. We don't have to go into each of them in detail, but essentially based on the actual costs of installations done recently and some very recent cost studies, including the one that Edmonton is really ready, like it's a very high level cost certainty. The costings for level 2, particularly in these complex situations of being in a parking lot or on street, are an issue. Again, Jeannie was going to kind of talk to this one, but I think could we just actually maybe just hear from you, Sylvain, around like how you guys came to this dollar amount and what you're thinking in terms of its adequacy for this particular applications of on street and in parking lots and public spaces.
I mean, all the amount has been based on literature review, and we also have a working group committee who have done a lot of looking at the cost of installing infrastructure. So, we always try to pay, and we're always going to pay 50% of the project to a maximum, and that maximum was determined by average cost, and that's where we landed on that number, and we actually talked about that number with through a bit of consultation and the working group. So that's how it was determined, but I know it's not probably perfect science. One thing that we've learned in the other program is that $50,000 was for some was challenged, but was the right amount. I mean, the projects are coming. It's not a full barrier. We've seen deployment in communities and by provinces. So the amount of projects spoke by itself. Is the 5,000 the right amount? We'll see, and we can always adjust the amount. Once we complete that first call for proposal. If we see that it's challenging, people are not having it's not enough for the project, and as we start to look at real costs for the project, then we can always adjust. But right now, I think we went with our best work from the information that we had. Is it something that can change for the next RFP? Absolutely. We can look at costs and how we can rebalance or readjust the cost to be more reflective of real situation. But again, the range was quite large when you ask for for level 2. Some people will say, well, it's $10,000 to install. Some will tell you it's $3,000 to install. So you'll get all kind of numbers. So we felt confident with the 5. Something that we can look after this call for proposal, and as we get more experience with the project being delivered.
So then, to follow up to that, for your when you came up with the average on particular level 2s, I know your previous deployments are concentrated on mostly level 3s. So where are you drawing the actuals from level 2s? And I know geographically speaking, like things can change depending on geographical, like certain places may be cheaper than others. So I'm just trying to get an idea where your average installation price, particularly for level 2s, came from.
So some work that we've done actually with an infrastructure working group that we held at NRCan. So we've done some kind of looking as we were, especially when we decided to put to our proposal to Treasury Board to explain how would that cost. We had to provide evidence about having the right amount, but that is always notional. What we've put forward was always notional. So the 5,000 was reflected from what we've seen, what we've heard from experience of other projects. I mean, it's a lot of information that we kind of decided to land on. That's where we came up with that number. Is it the perfect number? We'll see. I can't really know right now because this first year for our first RFP, we don't have the experience yet. We haven't seen the project with their total project cost, so it's probably something that that we'll verify it after. But for now, this is what we heard, and this is a number that we base ourselves. Same way that we did for the fast chargers. It was the kind of same work that we've done to identify that $50,000 for a fast charger would be the appropriate amount. Now, the project may cost. We've seen through the deployment project that cost 3 times what we expected actually, and they still went forward to it. And some project that we're able to do some and install it like below the 100,000 threshold. So we'll see when we get the project, when we have more experience. But right now, I think we're confident that the 5,000 was the right amount for this call for proposal.
So Sylvain, who's on the, not by name, but just in general, who's on such a working group committee, this infrastructure working group committee? Do you have municipalities on there who have this experience of actual installations?
So I'll have to check it because I don't have the list with me, but I know the group is composed of equipment manufacturer. We have governments, provincial government. I'm sure we have cities, actually not all cities, but some cities on that working group. We have associations. So we have a really good breadth of the industry through that working group. I think there's over if I'm not mistaken, over 40 participants in that working group. So, and that was work that we've done actually when the federal government was looking at target for zero-emission vehicle deployment. Actually, so there was a lot of work that went into it. So that's where that information came from and was validated by those groups. So, and again, we went back to look at what's out there, more recent information that we could provide to come up with that number. But again, it's not a number that was all approved. It's an average, or what we've seen actually in what we could base our decision on.
Okay, so I think we won't hit and talk on all of these exact actual cost examples, but I'll send you this slide deck afterwards, and you can have these, and you can follow up with Jeannie for her costing study. Or I'll also send the costing study that Edmonton's just recently done for their 19 level 2 stations. And a lot of these are also ones that are being cherry picked, right? These are the ideal sites. These are the sites that are going to require the least amount of work. So I guess that kind of goes to this last section. The concern I have, a lot of the work that CUSP does, one of our strategic priorities or our areas of research and planning is around centering equity in our low carbon transition and in our climate action plans and work. So I'm a little concerned about I think that the $5,000, I think you're gonna be oversubscribed, because I think you're gonna have a lot of free riders on this particular first one. People who have already done the work, who are probably gonna go ahead and do this without the incentive. So I think you're gonna see some free ridership on this particular one, and so the 5,000 is just icing on the cake. But based on the actual cost studies that these guys have all done, it falls real short, and it particularly falls short if if the goal is to have a ubiquitous build out as opposed to a build out that is strategized on the basis of where the lowest cost is. And Megan has some examples around, you know, the differences between rural and urban, but then also looking at, you know, there's a lot of studies, and I've got a few resources here that are hyperlinked that I could share with that I'll share with you there too, but that also show that, you know, what we're seeing are some charging deserts. So people are putting charging infrastructure in where the existing charging EV vehicles are registered, which tend to be in your higher income white neighborhoods, and they're putting them in where it's simple, where the community centers are, where the parking lots are, etc. And we're finding that through these studies, are finding in the UK that we're basically entrenching greater inequities and the unlikelihood that these other neighborhoods are actually going to invest in electric vehicles because the charging infrastructure isn't going in there, particularly the charging infrastructure when it has incentives, which is right now. And in the future, when there's no incentives for the vehicles and there's no incentives for the charging infrastructure, they're even less likely to participate, and they would have had a harder time accessing to participate in the first place in these lower income and neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. So I'm just curious what NRCan's thinking around how to strategize for not just simply the lowest cost build out, but how to ensure that there's equitable distribution of these charging stations throughout communities, within communities, and throughout neighborhoods.
So this is where I think for a program like us is difficult, because ultimately we're dependent on the proposal submitted and the strength and the quality of the proposal. So because we're not paying for all, if we were paying for all of it and we had the luxury to install them where we wanted, then we can actually really start to dictate where things needs to be. But we're very dependent on the application that we receive and their business case. So this is why it's very important that as people are applying to explain, you know, the need, the reason why they want to install those charging systems. But you know, one thing that we always look also is, you know, they're putting their money also towards that infrastructure. So it's their also investment. So we need to make sure that the business case makes sense. But ultimately, we're going to let the market kind of not dictate, but guide where it's happening. We were surprised when we launched, you know, the infrastructure, the first program. One of the first projects was to electrify New Brunswick and Nova Scotia highways through partnership with Nova Scotia Power and MD Power. So they were the right partners to do it, and that's what we saw, like one of the first projects to be deployed. Not, you know, it was not, you know, it was away from Quebec and Ontario and BC. So we're hoping that through the program there'll be distribution and an equal distribution, but that's always dependent on what we receive at the end of the day. So we can eventually in future years decide to target certain area if we feel that they're underserved or we want to attract a certain investment. But for now, we'll let the market kind of go where people are willing to invest and where the business case makes sense, and see where it goes. So right now, like I said, it's the first year. We're going to have the luxury to be able to change and look at our experience and modify what we need to do to make sure that we reach the right deployment. But again, dependent on what comes.
Does anyone have any? I know we're running just a couple of minutes over, but does anybody have anything they want to add to this particular conversation around the amounts and specifically around how to ensure more equitable and ubiquitous build-outs? I will say that most of the cities that we've talked to, because of the funding amounts, are choosing off-street in almost every application. I think Victoria is planning on doing some on-street, but for the most part, they're just, the cost to go on-street and curbside are so great, and the funding amount is seen to be so minimal that most are looking at off-street applications only.
Yeah, and it's not to say that, like I said, I was going to say, it's not to say that what we've put forward is perfect, and again, for the next RFP, we can relook at that number. So I don't want to discourage people that this is it, and this is going to be $5,000, and we're going to try to adapt as well and respond to the market and what we see. So we're quite flexible, and I think that's the beauty of this program, that we'll be flexible to really make sure that we put the right amount out there. But that's the key. It's the right amount and not too much money, and then it's just it's just becoming like a cash grab. So we really want to find that sweet spot, but we can change that as we have more experience. So I don't want to discourage people that this is it for the program. We can have that conversation and really look at the numbers for the next RFP for sure.
I think the other thing that could be done in future RFPs probably would be to add into your merit-based questions and rankings extra points for how they're addressing equity and inclusivity. Would be an easy one
that is
too.
actually that is viewed through and part of the objective and the purpose of the deployment. There's in the merit, we want that kind of story, that narrative. Actually, that's what we want to see, that narrative that says this is why we want to do deployment in that particular area, because we feel that there's a greater need, and they can explain and demonstrate it. That adds value to the proposal, and that is part of the merit base.
Great. Anyone else?
It's Megan. I was just going to add that sort of categorized level 2 installation schedule may be a thing to consider as well. Wall mount versus curbside versus on street versus off street. I know Allison's sending you the slides, but the example of our lowest cost install at $5,000, so about $10,000 total with the station, was a wall mount where the panel happened to be right on the other side of the wall. You just don't get any cheaper than that, but you also are not really flexible with your locations if that's your the criteria, right? Anyway, that's just for food for thought for future.
While you're speaking, Megan, why don't you talk just for a second to sort of that some of the issues in the rural communities are not necessarily around getting the charging infrastructure installed, but is a concern or a deterrent is around the O&M costs that the municipality would be assuming?
So that's associated really with the fast chargers. I guess the issue that we've got, and I'm not sure how to work around this in the future, is that the market dictates that it is not a good business case to invest in any infrastructure in rural areas. There's not going to be a NRCan or a I can't think of, or Electrify Canada or a VW investing in small rural communities because the business case doesn't exist. And at the same time, utilities are focused on infrastructure that also gets high usage. So we're having a bit of a struggle here in rural communities, making that business case and alleviating the capital costs for fast charging infrastructure in these communities is one way to attract investment of the ongoing O&M. In the case of Southern Alberta, it was covering 100% of the capital and having an energy competitive bid approach to identify an energy company to own and operate over 10 years. So that was successful because we eliminated that capital burden in these rural areas. So yeah, it just goes to your point, Allison, around really like if the intent is to provide equitable access to charging, not just for those rural communities, but for folks in urban areas traveling through. I just think that there probably is a different, and I don't know what the answer is, but a different approach or separate funding mechanism to address that gap.
Yeah, and the other point I want to bring up is I know that BC and Quebec has matching, not matching, but other provincial funding to install charging stations too. I know none of the prairies provinces have those, so the business case to doing these in the prairies right now may not be as attractive as in provinces where there is other sources of funding. So you're likely going to get less projects in areas where there's no provincial funding on top of the NRCan funding.
Again, could be. I think right now it's hard for me to say. Again, like I said, when we with the current program that we have, we're starting to see a coast-to-coast network being deployed, and you know, right now it's only BC and Quebec that have strong programs, but the deployment's happening everywhere. So I think I don't want to you know, assume that there'll be less. I think you know, I'm gonna let the RFP speak for itself and see what kind of project. If we get to year 3 and year 4 and we think that there's a real big problem, then we have to do our homework and readjust and try to do something. But for right now, I think we'll see what happens. We were surprised from the first program where deployment went. Let's see, and then if we need to adjust, then yes, we can adjust after. But for right now, I get it. There's always the concern of attraction and especially the investment, because ultimately someone has to provide the other 50% of funding, right? So who's willing to invest? That might be a challenge, but you know, as more cars come to on road and some provinces come up with programming, who knows where the deployment may happen. So we'll keep an eye. We definitely need something to be conscious of and to adapt if needed.
Okay, I think the last place we were just going to leave off is just kind of looking forward to future phases and how we can be more collaborative with you guys. Perhaps I know Ian's given a lot of time and some others like Brendan McEwen to the development of a lot of these programs and stuff like that. But just wanted to see if there was a way to use the CUSP network or BC Hydro CM network or whatever to help municipalities provide some more feedback in the draft of programs in future, like being able to share some of our actual costing information with you guys might be helpful. But also, you know, we're here on the ground and have the local context and have local connections and contacts that we could be helping to promote the programs as they go out to, you know, for MURBs and workplaces where the applicants won't always be the municipality as much anymore. As well as, you know, I think there's some more creative solutions with a little bit of support where we could actually be helping as cities to be conveners for those private applicants in terms of having joint procurement arrangements that they could piggyback on. Making sure that they understand what the regulatory requirements are and getting some specifications out to them and some really easy, friendly documents that help explain the technical stuff. And maybe that's if the third parties like Fraser Basin Council are going to be doing that, then maybe the cities don't have to step into that role. But I think absent someone doing that locally, I think, yeah, anyways, I just see that there's some potential for cities to collaborate. Is there anything that's come up for you or from this call that you would see some value in working with cities for future rounds?
I think absolutely, and I think that's where we are really focusing our effort to make sure that the city become and cities and municipalities become kind of the lead of that deployment. So it's our first call, it's our first interaction, and I'm glad that we've established this. You know, I also work with FCM, and I will meet with FCM to really understand, you know, what needs to be done to make sure that we have equal participation and we get all types of cities from all areas to participate. The third party was not launched because we felt that there was more work to be in the design of it, and I'd be willing to have another call or have even a working session just to make sure that we do it right. So absolutely, we can continue that conversation, we can continue that work. The first RFP was launched because we had to launch something very quickly, and then the election was coming, and so we had a lot of things working against us. But we wanted to make sure that we could send a signal that we were ready to go, and that we're willing to accept project. But for the third party, we need to make sure that we do it well and it's well developed. So I'm willing to have some future call over the next summer and early fall, just to make sure that we do it right. So.
Fair enough. And I just want to add one caution with FCM is all locally based in Ottawa, so they don't have a different context, and they don't work on the ground, and they're not technical experts. So they're very helpful to us in a lot of regards related to advocacy, but they take their direction from elected officials, and that's who they interact with the most, and the elected officials do not know this level of detail and technical detail. So the FCM will be useful to you in talking about how to get knowledge exchange out and how to use their existing hubs and resources and their regional facilitators, for instance, in getting this information out. But in the design of your programs, they will not have the technical and subject matter expertise and local context expertise from working in local government, because they don't come from that background.
And this is why we'll look at multiple partners such as yourself to make sure that we get it right. So of course, we're not just going to work with one organization. And the more organizations that we're willing to work with, I think it's just going to enrich us moving forward and making sure that we do the right thing. I mean, we always have some limitation within our own government of what we can do, and I mean all of this is under a certain terms and conditions. But I think the key message here is that there's flexibility. We can adapt the program, and we're willing to work with anyone who's willing to help us to make sure that we have it right. So that is FCM, that is your organization, or directly municipalities. I mean, we had calls with Fraser Basin Council. I called with Government of Quebec, Government of BC, to make sure that we do it right. So yeah, so as anyone that we can get some knowledge and experience, we'll take it.
Awesome. Well, I mean, this has been a really helpful call in my opinion. And again, I'm coming into this a little bit newer than most of the rest of you all on the call who are living and breathing this all the time. So it's been very helpful for me to understand better and be able to relate to the rest of our members, as particularly some of them who aren't as far along as some of the folks on the phone here. I really appreciate your time. I am very grateful that there's a lot of future rounds to come over the next 4 years, and that you're planning on putting out a single each stream every year. It means there's a lot of opportunity for cities to look to future streams and not to panic about if they can't jump on board this particular one, which is going to be a bit tight for those who aren't already in a ready position. So I do thank you for your time. I think the other thing it will point out too is that cities need to get going on their on the development of their strategies, and I think that goes to another conversation that we're having right now with Aaron and Terry, which is around what is the capacity building support that we could be providing to cities to help them with all of this technical design and siting and the development of their EV strategies and EV policies for charging infrastructure and new construction and all the rest of it, because I do think there's a gap there where most cities, regardless of their size, are finding that they just don't have the capacity to keep up with the demand and the opportunity here.
And it's something that we recognize that I was going to say it's something that we recognize. We're trying to navigate into this world, and we're trying to do things quickly, and there's a lot of pieces that needs to be looked at. So yeah, and we value that the partnership that we have. But I will say it's not easy at times just to make sure that we do it right. But something for the municipalities, as we move along, like in future years, the RFP, and we're going to try to keep the RFP very similar, the criteria very similar. So what you've seen, you could expect to be pretty much the same for the next RFP. So then the experience will come, and there'll be, and we're hoping that applying will get easier and easier because the criteria are the same, the requirement will be the same, maybe some changes just to make sure that we adapt. But we don't want to depart from one RFP to the next too far, because then it's a learning curve every time. So it's the first one. We'll see how that goes, and we're going to be there to support you. But rest assured that what you've seen will be similar in other RFPs. So if you don't make it this time, there's going to be the next time for sure.